on the live stream. And those of you who are here in the Zoom room at Wilshire Boulevard, my name is Saul Kaiserman. It's an honor and a delight to be back to do some Torah study with you this morning. Um, we're doing, I haven't seen you all since the new year. So first of all, Happy New Year. It's great to be back with you again. Um, I hope that you had pleasant holidays and that the year has started strong for everyone. Certainly, there's been some hopeful things for the Jewish people since the start of the new year. So we'll try and stay with that kind of as a prayer. And speaking of prayer, why don't we do the prayer for Torah study to begin our session together? So please join together with me if you'd like. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav banu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Blessed is the one, the power that has commanded us to engage ourselves with the learning and study of Torah so deeply that we might think of it as our business. And it is our business, after all. What would be more important for us than studying Torah? I am excited to be doing this week's Torah portion, Noach. I mean, I know you're not supposed to play favorites, but really this is probably one of my favorite Torah portions in the entire five books. I suspect that many of you have studied this many times at this point, and there are elements of it that me coming in without having studied with you in the past, I might run a danger of repeating elements that you've looked at in great depth already. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to, knowing that this is one of the most well-known stories of the Ark, I want to give like a little setting for it, and then we'll look a little bit at text, a little bit about the origin of the story, and where I really want to focus, I think, is on the meaning of the story for us, because I think there's a lot of potential for us in this story to think about how one of the oldest human stories can still be relevant in a contemporary way. So I don't have strong evidence for this, but it appears to me, I would conjecture that this story, the story of Noah's Ark, is one of the oldest human stories. Like I would conjecture that this story goes back to like prehistoric times, like to our like Homo sapien and Neanderthal ancestors, like whatever point it was when parents started telling stories to their kids, this story dates back to then. Like we have the version of it in the Bible that dates back, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000, 4,000, maybe longer than that years, and redacted into the form that we have now, maybe 2,500 years ago. But I would propose that this is a story that goes back 10,000, 20,000, 60,000 years. Like I think this is a very old story. Um, and over time, the story became more complicated. People forgot certain elements of the story. People told the story differently in different cultures. As you, I'm sure, know, there's a Greek version of the flood story. There's Mesopotamian versions of the flood story. We're not the only tradition that held on to this story. So my conjecture is that, once upon a time, it was very, very rainy outside and water was rising and lightning was crashing and all the children were afraid and all the parents told them the story of Noah's Ark as a way of comforting them as a bedtime story. There was once a time when the whole world had become wicked and evil, and God got so angry with those people that God decided to cover the whole world with water. Um, so here's your SAT bonus word if you don't know. We usually say flood, but actually, technically, it was a deluge when it rains so hard that it floods. So, really, it should be called the story of the deluge, not the story of the flood. Um, God speaks to one of our ancestors, and decides to save that person and that person's family, just like God is going to rescue you, my little children, from this scary rainstorm and the lightning and thunder outside. Now, that's just my conjecture, but it seems to me to be a reasonable thing to assume about the origins of the story. So let's start with talking about that righteous man, Noah. Noah appears at the end of the book of Bereshit, at the end of book of Genesis. We learn at that point of Noah's birth, and that Noah found favor with God. But at the beginning of this week's Torah portion in Genesis 6:9, we're introduced to Noah. Does someone who has a chumash or a text in front of them, would you be willing to read for us this first verse in 6:9?
Sure, I'll read.
Thank you.
There are the offspring of Noah. Um, ooh, hold on. A righteous man, perfect was he in his generation. With God did Noah walk. Noah begot three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Okay, let's stop there. That gives us Noah. Then the story is going to begin of what happens. But let's stay with that. So, um, that
I
translation is,
have a comment, an interesting comment.
oh yeah,
Uh,
go ahead.
and you were talking about how we deal with this today.
Yeah.
I think it's important. This is where it says Noah was a righteous man in his time, and there were different rules, and he may not, if we were looking at him under today's morality, no one would think he was such a great guy. And I think this says a lot about a lesson for cancel culture. And, the people say we can't have any Jefferson high schools, we can't have any Washington high schools. I think it's important to remember, as God didn't, as we are taught, you have to look at people in relationship to others and their own civilization in their own time.
Uh, Great. So you're talking about the context both of the storyteller and of the people who are transmitting that story, which clearly has parallels for our own times, both, let's say, the original monument that people might be finding problematic, and the choice about what do subsequent generations do in making use of that monument. So excellent point. And actually, that's exactly where I wanted to go. So in your, not to the cancel culture part, but to the critique of Noah part. So here in the text, it says Noah was a righteous man, bedoro tav, in Noah's generation. Now, as early as the earliest midrashim, the earliest commentaries that we have on this verse, the rabbis were troubled by this verse, and Rashi has a very, very famous critique or question that's raised about this. The problem is, why does it say Bedorotav, in his generation? What extra information are we supposed to be getting by hearing that Noah was not only righteous, but he was righteous in his generation? What's the point of that? So Steve is hypothesizing that what it's saying is that Noah was righteous in comparison to the wicked people who were around at his time. But had he been born in our generation, we would say not so righteous, not so impressive. Um, does anyone want to take a different stance than that? Giving Steve complete credit, like the rabbis. That's what the rabbis agree with him. They say, had Noah lived in the generation of Abraham, Noah would not have been accounted even as even being important. Okay, Mara, sorry, and
Oh,
Han.
I just have a question because my understanding that is that the translation is in his generations, plural.
It is, but I don't have a source that explains why generations versus generation. It could be that it's making a comparison also to the generations that came before him and up to him. That would be my hypothesis, but I don't have a source for that. Do
Well,
you have a
so
thought on that?
I'm looking at this says, as Rashi explains, I therefore think it comes to teach us an additional matter. Each and every generation is connected at its root to a specific mitzvah, which it needs to establish more than others. For example, one generation might be connected to the root that leads it to establish the commandment of ritual fringes more than other commandments. So every generation at its root must grasp a specific mitzvah more than the others. And scripture teaches us that Noah was perfect in his generations. This means that in every generation, he lived, he held and established the root mitzvah that was specific to that generation. So he lived among many generations.
That's beautiful. That's a Rashi commentary that you're reading? I
Yes,
don't, I have what I thought was Chumash with Rashi here. I don't see that in here, but maybe it's a commentary on a different verse. That's fantastic. So how do you interpret that, Mara?
that that we are influenced by multiple generations, that um, that Noah was influenced by many generations, and therefore many generations had to be destroyed rather than just one generation.
Oh, I love that. So that's a little bit the kind of Schindler's List quote. If you destroy a single life, then you destroy the world. And if you save a single life, then you save the world. I love that. That's great. So all of the generations that were wiped out in Noah's age, they didn't perpetuate, but Noah now becomes the ancestor of generations. I love that. Okay. I'm just going to go down the line over here. Ray, you were the next hand I saw.
Thank you. It took me just a moment to unmute. Um, I find it meaningful and important um, that we see a difference, a behavioral difference in the between Noah and certainly Abraham in terms of their relationship with God, their dialogue with God, and the way they receive, process, experience, and engage with God when God tells them what to do. And I think it's centrally important that when God a little bit later is negotiating with Abraham, and Abraham, instead of just saying, okay, God, whatever you say, God, I'll build an ark or whatever it is, that he's engaging with God and says, will you spare the town for the sake of the 10? Will you spare the town ultimately for the sake of the one righteous man? And I think it's a really crucial distinction. A righteous man of his generation, of Noah's generation, is perhaps one that's a good, obedient man who simply takes what God says at God's word. But a later consideration and a more complete one, since God is, on a good day, ambiguous, I think, even in Torah, is when God says something that you don't think makes sense, you make it make sense, whether you process it differently yourself or whether you have an opportunity to have a direct negotiation with God, bringing, as Abraham did, your own conscience. So I think the text suggests that Abraham is indeed a more righteous man because he stuck out his neck and brought his conscience to the negotiation.
I love that. That's fantastic. And I love the example that you give of Abraham arguing with God and Noah not arguing. I think that's spot on. Rashi, I think, would agree with you. He pulls the words from this sentence, not Bedorotav only, but Hit Halech Noach. Et ha Elohim, Hit Halech Noach. Noah walked with God. Rashi points out, based on Genesis Rabbah, that Abraham has a sentence in Genesis 24:40 where he walks before God. And so Rashi interprets that based on Genesis Rabbah to mean that Noah needed God's kind of moral support and strength and to walk side by side with God, whereas Abraham was able to walk in his righteousness on his own, like kind of take the lead. And that not only does that fit nicely with the text, but it really supports the case that you just made that Abraham took the lead in the conversation with God about the righteous people as opposed to Noah who just went along. So beautiful, beautiful point.
Thank you
Cindy,
for sharing that. Fascinating.
yeah. Thank you. Cindy, go ahead.
I know it wasn't your question, but I agree with Steve that it doesn't really say what the people were doing at the time, that it uses in my book the word corrupt, and the world was filled with violence. But this was the time before the 7 Noah rules. It was the time before the commandments of Sinai, so that my impression is that Noah was behaving closer to God's expectations than the other people without being given the laws and the rules.
Oh, interesting. So, like, people have to figure it out on their own at this point, whereas later on, Moses and onward, we've actually got, like, here's what you're supposed to do in order to be righteous. So, that would be an argument on the counterpoint in a way, right? That Noah actually was is more righteous than in any other generation because he had to figure it out on his own in comparison not to Abraham, but to later generations, let's say our generation, where God has explicitly told us how to behave. And actually, that Rashi brings up that it you could read this Bedorotav, Bedorotav either way. You could say that had Noah lived in a different generation of righteous people, he would have been even more righteous because of the force of his good example. So it was only because he was brought down by the people of his own generation that he was less righteous. Had he been living in a more righteous time, he would have been considered more righteous. So Rashi is willing to let either of those points go, although I think ultimately, because of this other verse that we just discussed, I think he does kind of take the side of the
But
opposing.
why can't it be both?
Why it could? What do you mean? I think it's
I
ambiguous
think
and would
that
allow it
you
to be
you
both.
can judge him in two ways. One, his actions viewed under, I mean, in terms of, he wasn't so righteous, is really viewing it in terms of today, and nobody would say that. And so you're looking at him, but by the same token, he's even better because he rose above
Hmm.
such I think two things can both be true.
I love that. That's great. That's great. I like that. And I mean, I like the ambiguity in the text that we often see in the Bible because it allows for multiple interpretations. And I really appreciate your ability to hold two interpretations side by side and bring them forward in a way that we can hear the truth in both of them at the same time. That's fantastic. Brad, why don't you take one more point on this?
Well, the text troubles me because it seems to introduce a concept of moral relativism. And, if you're moral in one generation, you're 10 generations later, that should still be more considered moral. So it's sort of a Kantian universalism idea of morality rather than moral relativism.
Are you saying that this text is based on a premise of universal?
No, I think it's based on the contrary, on the idea of moral relativism. He was moral in his age. If he's moral in his age, then he should be deemed moral in our age as well. If you're moral, you're moral, period.
So for you, the comparison itself is problematic. You don't want
Yes.
people to be judged like that person is better than another person. You just want to say, is the person good or isn't the person good? There's no grading on a curve in ethics the way that you're looking at it.
Well, I mean, I just oppose to the idea of moral relativism when we say that he was a good person in his age. If he's a good person in his age, then from a morality point of view, we would also consider him a good person in our age.
Okay, I think that's a fair point. I think
I mean,
that's a
if you're
fair,
moral, you're moral. And if
yeah.
you're not, you're not.
All right. Well, I see you're getting some response. Let's go to David first and then Steve. Let's see what people have to say about this.
Well, the first sentence is this is Noah's chronicle. So a chronicle is a historical development of something. And as you pointed out, whether this story is 25 narrative 2,500 years old, 3,000 years old, from the Garden of Eden on. So from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were very naive, very no evil existed at the time. Then throughout the years, and Noah, I forget how old Noah was at this time, if he was 600 years or something, then the people have developed from Adam and Eve to the people who lived in his generation. And when it mentioned that Noah walked with God doesn't walk with everyone. I don't know how many people God walked with or faced other than Moses and Noah and maybe a couple others, but
Hmm.
I don't think it's relativism in that this is the development of good and bad people, and then as it later on goes, that Cindy mentioned, the next phrase, the earth was filled with violence and there was corruption. But anyways, I just think that it's the historical development of people and Noah particularly.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying, how could we have expected more from Noah when it wasn't like people didn't even know about kashrut yet, or people didn't know about these different ways that we might say later on are going to be revealed to Moses. So, how could we even have that expectation of Noah?
Correct. These people were developing and, they didn't treat each other nicely. There were primitive instincts. They might have stolen from each other. There might have been wanton sexuality. There were no morals, or the morals just took time to develop. So anyways, I have it's a great very thought-provoking parsha, and this whole couple sentences.
Great. Wait, I'll throw in because the question was raised about what exactly does it mean to say the earth became corrupt and the earth was filled with lawlessness. Rashi at least claims it means lewdness, lewdness, and idolatry, violence, and robbery. The idolatry clearly fits in with what you're saying, David, because if he's the only one who's walking with God and nobody else even knows that there's one God or that there's a God of all, then how can we really fault all those people for their idolatry if they didn't even know about it? And Rashi is pulling that based on intertextual readings, like where the words that are used here are used in other places. Brad, do you want to sharpen your point before
Well,
I bring it
yeah,
back?
I mean, I don't think we need the Ten Commandments to tell us that killing is immoral. We don't need the Ten Commandments to tell us that. That's the categorical imperative, according to Kant.
But Brad, the
Okay.
first,
It is a universal.
but Bereshit, Cain kills Abel. It's one of the first things that happens.
And there was human
Yeah,
sacrifice.
All right, let's go to Steve
right.
and
Okay.
Mara.
But
I'm
to say,
confused.
but to base an argument on the fact that, well, we didn't have the Torah yet, and we didn't have the Noahide laws yet, is somehow an justification. To me, it goes against the idea of what morality is. Morality is a
Brad,
universal type of system of behavior.
Okay, I've
To
been
be clear,
Brad.
Brad's point is not about whether or not Noah was moral. Your point is about, do we like the way that this text is written,
Right.
and how we're receiving this text? Should we have left out that in his generation, because that itself doesn't work for our
But
generation? Okay, Steve and then
I don't
Mara.
I don't understand Brad's point exactly, and maybe he can clarify because Brad is saying morality, there's an absolute, and if you're moral at one time, you're moral at other times. And that can, to me itself can mean two things. And I'll just take the case of Thomas Jefferson. I mean, our fathers and what they created in this country was truly extraordinary, especially for what was going on at the time. And they had incredible achievements. And
Okay.
they were considered moral in their time despite owning slaves, and I can argue that slave ownership is an immoral imperative in any context. So do we look at them as moral because in their time they were moral, and if they were moral then we should view them as moral now? Or are you saying despite everything they did in the context of their world and the creation of this country, they were still immoral people?
You can be immoral and still do good things. I
So you're
think
saying,
owning slaves was immoral. It was immoral behavior, period. It was immoral then. It was immoral now. It's always been immoral.
well,
So Brad, what do we
I'm not
do?
I'm not convinced that's true, especially when you go back to early civilizations and sacrificing to God. And if that's the premise of your belief and that is what is treated as good in your society, uh, I don't I mean, yes, I we believe in the context of what we know that there's this moral imperative and it's obvious, but through the course of history, I think that's asking too much of ancient peoples.
Okay, I love this. I think we're it's great that we're pulling on to a philosophical level here. Mara, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, first of all, my response to Brad would be in the beginning, God created. At that point, there is a code of morality. It was created when the world was created. Um, Secondly, I think the reference to Noah being moral in his generation can easily mean that Noah was a moral man, that the rest of the world around him might have chosen not to be, but he was a moral man, and he was aware of the morality that God created when the world was created. Um, Now, my problem with Noah is when Noah returns after the flood, there doesn't seem to be any interest in what may have survived, that he comes to inhabit a world that he, in essence, views as his.
Hmm.
And it would seem to me that in any disaster, a moral person might seek to help others
You're talking after the flood or on the way
after the
into the
flood.
That's very interesting. Um, I let me say two things here, and then we'll move on to another topic. Although I love this one. One is I think we need to remember that we have to look at the language of the Bible from within the perspective of the written text of the Bible as well. And so Abraham is being called righteous and is a slave owner, right? He has Hagar and other servants, but clearly they're slaves. So there's concubines and other people among those that are explicitly called righteous. So some of this is, I think we have to take the Bible's language from the perspective of the people who were recording it. That doesn't mean we have to agree with it in our times. So, Brad, I don't want you to let go of this point. I think that it's a legitimate one, but I just want to also name it gets complicated if we don't a little bit look at the text as we've inherited it and say it got fixed at one point and that's what we're going to work with. Um, in terms of like Noah's reaction post Ark, Mara, I've always interpreted him as being traumatized by the experience. The first thing that Noah does after getting off the Ark is plants a vineyard and then gets drunk. So I've always, maybe not always, but for a long time, have interpreted it as Noah was really brokenhearted by this experience. And so I want to give maybe a little bit of a charitable reading in the narrative to Noah's behavior post Ark that, he may have just been so, but he sometimes when people are in that traumatized state, they're not able to do exactly what you're describing. I'm more concerned about his behavior pre-Ark. Why didn't he argue on behalf of other people in his generation? That I for sure have some issues with. Yeah, go ahead, Harv.
Uh, One of the things I'm reading here in the text commentary is that there's a rabbi who says Noah is rendered special homage, for nothing is more difficult than to be honest, peaceful, and loving when deceit, violence, and hatred are accepted patterns of society. So what this rabbi is saying, Rabbi Resh Lakish, I guess is his name, uh, he's saying that Noah was really a good person and he would have stood up as a good person and moral in every generation, which is Brad's point. But
Uh,
that's my 2 cents.
Oh my God. I love that you brought a quote from Reish Lakishin. It makes so much sense that he would have been the one to say this because he would be basing it on his experience. Reish Lakish, before he became a rabbi, had been a gladiator and a robber and like had lived among the people who were exactly those kinds of people that you're just describing in that quote. And so clearly, like, he's the advocate for the other way of looking at in his generation, and he's speaking from personal experience. If I could have risen from my bad upbringing and my earlier wickedness in order to be sitting here as, a member of the leadership of the Jewish people and a renowned rabbi whose words we're still reading today. So I thank you so much for bringing that in. Let's let that be the final word on this topic, because I do want to move us to, I love the question of origins of these stories, and the Noah story, as you may know or may not know, is given as one of the best examples of places where we can see different sources stitched together in the Bible into one structure, because in the Noah story, we can really see a lot of the seams of where, according to scholarship for about 200 years at this point, two originally independent stories about Noah have been brought together into one story. Now, do you all know this already, or am I repeating stuff that you know, or is this? No, I see some heads shaking. Great. Okay, so let's take a look at two verses and you'll see the kind of thing I mean, and then I'll give you some more examples. Let's move down to verse 6, 19, and 20. Would someone else like to read? Steve, thank you for reading before. Is there anyone who's willing to read for us? We're still in chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. Thank you, Natalie. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Natalie, don't.
Okay,
There.
okay.
Thank you.
And of all that lives, of all flesh, you shall take 2 of each into the ark to keep alive with you. They shall be male and female. you want me to go further?
Yeah, one more verse, please.
Okay. From birds of every kind, cattle of every kind of creeping thing on the earth, two of each shall come to you to stay alive.
Okay, now I think, thank you. That was, you read beautifully. Now, I think that accords with the way that we usually tell the story, right? Can you kind of picture in your head like kind of a children's book image of an ark sitting and like animals lining up like zebras and giraffes and things, maybe in alphabetical order or whatever to get on? Do you have that image in your head, right? Like, so that's these two verses right here. Okay, let's scroll down now or flip our pages to chapter 7, just a little bit further along, verses 2 and 3. Okay, now God is telling Noah to come into the ark and who to bring into the ark. Can someone read for us out loud verses 2 and 3? Lynn, thanks. Don't forget to unmute.
Take
Uh,
7 pairs of every pure beast, a male and its mate, and 2 of every pure impure beast, a male and its mate. Of the birds of the sky, 2, take 7 pairs, male and female, to give life to offspring on the face of the earth. For in another
You can stop. You can stop there. You can stop there. Thank you. Okay. Is that the same as what we just read in chapter 6, or is it different?
7 pairs.
7 pairs,
Seven
right? Now,
Mhm.
not of every kind of animal, of the pure quote unquote animals, the clean animals, that means kosher animals, right? Even now, how Noah's supposed to know what's kosher and what's not kosher, that's a little bit unclear. But there's the two different ways that the story is being told. In one version, Noah's told take 2 of every animal. That's like kind of the way we think about it. In another version, he's being told no, take 7 pairs of every animal. Why would Noah need to take 7 pairs of the kosher animals? What could possibly be the rationale in that version of the story for Noah to need more pairs of some animals? Yeah, Marina?
He may need to be eating them while he's on the ark.
Yeah, it could be on the ark, it could be immediately afterwards, but he's either going to eat them or he's going to sacrifice them to God. And then there wouldn't be, if there were only 2 of them, then there wouldn't be other generations of those animals.
oh,
So we've got a different way of understanding how many animals are necessary on the ark. I'll give you some other just examples, and then we'll look at how the two stories get split into 2 parts. One set of sentences throughout chapters 6 and 7 refers to God as Yud He Vav He, usually translated as Lord, right? You can even see in the translation that I have from JPS, it just says, then Yud He Vav He said to Noah in chapter 7, verse 1. In other passages, um, God is referred to as Elohim. That's the way that we saw God back in chapter 6 when we were looking at it as Elohim. But that's not strange. That actually implies that there were 2 different authorial traditions, one that referred to God as Yud He Vav He, we call that the J source usually, and one that referred to God as Elohim, that's usually either the E source for Elohim or the priestly source, the source that which was perhaps based upon the E source and text of it, an earlier text, um, that then was written by or with the interests of the priesthood. And we talked about this a little bit when we were looking at Deuteronomy. Um, Other examples, Genesis 7:12, which refers to God as Yud He Vav He, says it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, that J source, the one that's like with the 2 pairs, the kind of children's version of the story that we know. On the other hand, Genesis 7:24, the priestly source, says the waters prevailed for 150 days. In Genesis 8, that same E, Elohim, the waters receded after 150 days. And the ark rested on Ararat on the 17th day of the seventh month. So in one version, the J version, 40 days and 40 nights. In another version, 150 days and then a very specific day, the 17th day of the seventh month, that the ark comes to rest in a very specific place. In the J source, again, the source that uses Yud He Vav He, again, the one I would characterize as like our kind of children's book version of the story. How does Noah know when the flood has come to an end? He sends out two birds. First, a raven, and the raven comes back, and then a dove, and the dove comes back with the olive branch, and Noah knows the water must be going down, and then he sends the dove out again, and the dove doesn't come back, and Noah says, oh, the dove must have found a place to land and is now living out there. That's the way that we know the story. But also, still in the same story, just a few verses later in Genesis 8, 13, and 14, now God being called Elohim, Noah removes the covering, sees the earth from the ark, like kind of opens the top of the ark, sees the earth is dry, and it tells us the specific dates. So in other words, we have lots of places in these chapters in the story of Noah where if we want to look at them as a unified text, we can, and that's what the rabbis had to do because they didn't have literary criticism the way that we have in a modern era. And they tried to come up with explanations for why does it say one thing in one verse and another thing in another verse, even though they contradict each other. But if we're going to look at it from a perspective of biblical source criticism, from a contemporary, more narrative approach, it's actually quite easy to tease apart two different tellings of the Noah story just by kind of pulling out this piece of this verse, this piece of this verse, and then lining them up side by side. So, with your indulgence, I'm going to now read you two different versions of the story. Um, One from the priestly source, like kind of stitched together, and one from the J source, Yud Hey Vav source. So this is kind of skipping around, but if you want to kind of follow along, if you start with Genesis 7, verse 6, I'm going to be bebopping between verses 6 and verses 24, and if that makes sense to you, I'm going to kind of go through it twice, and you're going to see how the translation is coming out in two different ways. Does that make sense? Okay, here we go. This is the priestly source. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, and all the flesh died that moved on the earth. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So in that priestly version of the story, we have it pretty straightforward. Rains for 40 days until it's time to until which point the ark rises up, and then the floods the entire planet until all the mountains are covered. Everything has died, and the waters are on the earth for 150 days. All right, now let's go back through those exact same passages, and this time let's listen to it with the Yud He Vav He, the J source. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went with him into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, two and two, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. Remember, there are only 2 by 2 in this version, not the clean animals. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, all entered the ark, and the Lord shut him in. The rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and the birds of the heavens. Okay, so do you see how each of those two different narratives kind of holds itself together? Like it's a fine story on its own. You don't actually need any of the other sentences from the other version of the story in order for it to make sense. And actually, it starts to raise questions for you if you pull together those two stories and try and do as the biblical redactor did, make it into one story. So why did that happen in the first place? Why didn't the biblical redactor just say, I'm going to pick this story and I'm going to tell this story? Why do we end up with a tradition that I think is much richer, much more complex, much more ambiguous, but could be read as having two stories that were combined and put together? Yeah, Steve, what do you think? Why do we have it like this?
Well, I have read, and it applies to the creation story as well as others, that there were different traditions in Judea and in the northern kingdom. And, and that, I think, can account for a lot. And although we had a winner, there was due respect paid to the northern kingdom, which had lost, to end up with a unified people. And there are also all kinds of other rules, like, how you treat images of animals. I mean, throughout the Torah, there are many, many of these differences. And that seems to me to be a very plausible explanation, how you unify two people, especially after one of the kingdoms has been destroyed and you want to regroup and survive.
Beautiful, beautiful. So one possibility as you're raising is that there were different, our ancestors were multiple. There wasn't just one group of people, certainly 12 tribes. They could have had their own stories, their own traditions. And each of the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, especially after the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, there was a need to give credence to their versions of the stories in order to unify the people. And I would say, especially in the time of the exile, even more so, you have the, royal class and the nobility and the scribes who are in exile. There's a desire to kind of come together in the face of disaster and say, we're one people. We can't be fighting among ourselves. We have to agree that we are one text is the same text. Beautiful. Anyone else want to weigh in on this, or shall we leave it at that? Brad, go ahead.
Well, I think maybe you could argue, this isn't a scientific work. This is a work of literature. And literature searches or wants richness. And this is a richer text because of the variants.
I love that. I mean, I think we do best when we think of the Bible as poetry. I think that it's meant to be evocative language. I agree. I think you said it's not a scientific text. Was that the way that or a historical text?
Mm.
I think that's right. I think if we look at the creation story from just last week and we say, how accurately does this describe the functioning of the universe? There's a lot of interesting, important parallels, but that's not going to get to the beauty of the text, which is really about meaning. How are we supposed to live our lives based on having read this text? David, go ahead.
Apparently, God did not wipe out the fish of the sea or any water living animals. Uh, and I don't know why. I mean, if fish didn't harm people, they couldn't be corrupt, I believe. But then other animals, the land animals, are not really corrupt. They don't have the intelligence, presumably, or the morality to do so. So it's curious why God didn't do that, didn't include
Yes.
them in his destruction.
That's interesting. So you're troubled by the fish surviving, but the birds and the beasts kind of being destroyed. That's fair.
I'm not saying I'm troubled. It's a question. I don't know why. I don't know if there's any
I'm
explanation.
sorry. I mean troubled by the text, not addressing that question. Yeah. Natalie, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say exactly that, but I was just thinking it, not saying it. And if you think about all the living things in the ocean, there's a lot of evil that goes on there too, between one killing the other, and whether you're bigger, you're stronger, therefore you have a right to eat all the small little fish. I guess there isn't enough room to write about everything. But just like David said, I'm sitting here thinking exactly why was that left out? Because these are also living creatures.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I mean, look, I think just staying within the sense of the narrative itself, you could argue that in order for God to wipe out all humans, there was no way not to wipe out all of the animals, even though the animals were blameless. But we can't apply human categories of
Right.
wickedness to non-human creatures, whether they're fish or you know birds or giraffes, because they're just doing what animals do. And so while we, from a contemporary perspective, may have trouble with, thinking of elephants or dolphins or other animals as being non-sentient and not having, any real, it seems to me that there are values and behaviors among non-human creatures that we might want to take seriously. For the biblical era, that doesn't seem to be how they're treating these texts. And so covering all the animals may just not have meant that much to them in terms of a moral concern. Um, but from a contemporary perspective, I do agree with you about that. And that's why I want to bring us now in our last minutes together to thinking about what do we do with this text? What does it mean to us? I think for many people, especially when I teach this text to children, the big question that they want to ask is, did this really happen? Right? And they want to look at it like a scientist or a historian. How could a boat really be big enough to hold two of all the animals in the world? Why didn't the animals all eat each other on the ark? Were there dinosaurs on the ark too? Were there unicorns on the ark? Where exactly in Turkey can we go in order to find the evidence of where the ark ended up when the waters receded, right? Like that's what they want to know. Lots of, and we want to know truth. But I'm interested in a different kind of truth, a truth that we've been debating over the course of this past 45 minutes of moral truth. Like, how are we supposed to behave? So what is, for me, the ultimate question is not, did this really happen? It's more, and this goes all the way back to those like prehistoric, origins, Homo sapien parents telling it to their young ones. What did they think was so important about this story that they felt it was worth passing along to their children? What message did they want their children to take away from this story, which does kind of come across like a children's story? What did they want them to learn about this righteous man getting on the ark, saving all of the animals in the world, not saving the other humans? What was the message for them that they wanted, and how do we make it a message for us? All right, so I'm going to go down the line again. Marina, go ahead.
I think the message is no matter what calamity or disaster, there is a way to survive and to survive as a family with your environment, with your with the animals and nature that sustain you.
Wow, beautiful, very rich. So it's ultimately a message of hope and a message of interconnectedness, the way that you're looking at it, that humans are not alone, that if we live together with the environment in a way that allow is kind of we can mutually reinforcing taking care of one another. If we
We
take
should
care,
be together. Yes.
yeah, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Steve, go ahead.
I think it's much more fundamental and like fairy tales. There's this great being out there called God, and look, if you're bad, you get wiped out, and if you're good, you get saved. saved and you will be protected. And it's just a simple moral tale with animals and people and what happens based on your behavior. The righteous are saved and everybody else is wiped out.
Great, great. So it's that like ancient, like, they're sitting in their home and it's raining really hard outside and the children are scared. And the children are like, the lightning is scary, the thunder is scary. And the parents tell them this story. Don't worry, that thunder and lightning is for the bad people out there. But God has promised never to punish the good people again. We're all going to be okay because God is trustworthy. And look, we can look out and we can see a rainbow, and that's God's promise that God will never do this to us the way God did it to others again.
Well, and also if you act like them, you're going to be out there next time.
That's right. That's right. So that's the warning to us, right? Like maybe you wouldn't be the one that would get on the ark, right? That's a warning to all of us, perhaps, right? Like if you aren't righteous and walking with God, perhaps the ark's going to leave without you. Merle, go ahead, and then Natalie.
I think it's an example of how we can be taught to help others or ourselves in an urgent situation, and that how to make ourselves survive, how to help ourselves and others survive.
So, meaning like you have to take action.
Right.
Is that what you're saying? That you can't just wait for, it's like the story of the rabbi who's, when the flood comes, you all know this joke, the flood is coming and the rabbi is like standing on the roof of his house and everyone's like, Rabbi, here's a boat coming by, get in the boat. And he's like, no, no, I have faith, God will save me. And then a helicopter comes by and the rabbi's like, no, 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 I have faith, the helicopter, you don't need me to save me, God will save me. And then he drowns and, when he gets to heaven, he's like, I don't understand. I had so much faith. Why didn't you save me? And God says, what are you talking about? I sent a boat. I sent a helicopter. Like, so I love that. I love that interpretation. Natalie, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. And I certainly wouldn't say this teaching children, but this is the beginning, and it is the same thing throughout the Torah as I've been studying this. God is telling you, these are the rules, this is what you have to do. You don't listen to God, you get punished. It is in so many places. And when people are really orthodox in terms of their beliefs, I know one or two like that, they truly feel fear if they do not follow the rules. And I guess this is really the only way you can make people really listen to you. Because if you think about it from the very beginning, this is a God that you don't touch, you don't feel, you don't know. And so, how in the world were you going to get all these people out in the desert to believe this? And that is a truth in life in general. You go to school, you're afraid if you don't listen to the teacher and you don't do your homework, you will not get a good grade, or you will, whatever it is, there is punishment in behavior very often. And so that's the way I see this, is this is just another beginning of the same thing. Go on, Brad.
Yeah, I guess I'm with Marina in the sense that I think it would be reassuring to children
I wouldn't do it to
knowing that God says he's never going to do this again. In other words, God accepts our immorality. We're back to this issue of morality, and God accepts the fact that we are immoral beings.
I don't think so. That's how I interpret it. When those two little boys touch the pan that they're not supposed to in another story, right in front of their father, God burns them up. That is the worst story for me to discuss. And in a way that's related to many parts. in the Torah where God is vicious if you don't listen. And I think it's very sweet to believe it maybe a different way, but this is the reality in life. You get punished in many ways in life if you don't follow laws. And that's really, control. How are you supposed to get control of all these people?
And sometimes you get punished even if you follow laws. So there is no
I mean,
prediction of how it's happening.
well,
I'm just
So,
not I'm just not sure that's the message of this particular
you're
story.
right on
I
that.
think the message of this story is one of acceptance.
Okay.
well, I think clearly you can read the story in a variety of different ways. Let's also take Mara, Harv. Did one of you want to weigh in before I make a final statement?
Oh, I was just going to say that um, we can look at the Noah story as rewarding goodness. And I don't um, I don't live my life the way I live because I have fear of being punished. I live my life the way I lived because observing what God asks of me makes me feel so good.
That's very lovely. You feel that way.
So that's kind of the mitzvah is its own reward, right? Like the sense that like who I am as a person is actually its reward. I can be imprisoned for my beliefs, but that's not going to make me say what I'm going to abandon is my beliefs. It's going to make me say my beliefs are going to keep me strong through the experience of imprisonment. I like that. And I mean, so I'll use that as a bridge to get to a closing, which is when I hear this story or think about this story, look, I try to think of myself as a good person. So I try to think of myself as I made it onto the ark, right? Like I'm more like Noah than like one of the ones who didn't make it onto the ark. Um, and I think Noah probably felt somewhat imprisoned on this ark. Like, whether it was 40 days or 150 days that Noah's on the ark, you know, he's cleaning up after the chimpanzees and the orangutans and breaking up fights between the animals and like they're all tucked inside. It certainly, it must have been terrifying. As I say, like the whole time he's imagining like every relationship that he's had has been destroyed other than his immediate family. So it's a metaphor of responsibility to me. um, Noah is, I think, an imperfect model for responsibility. And I think we can learn a lot from that for our generation. Um, you hear people who talk about the future of environmental degradation as if they're going to be the Noah who's going to have like the safe haven in New Zealand or is going to build a spaceship that's going to take them to Mars. And they and the people that they choose are going to be the ones who are going to survive the environmental degradation. And I think we need to think about us as the people who didn't make it onto the ark potentially in their story of space arcs in New Zealand. Like, who do we want to be if we get onto the ark? Do we want to be like Noah and save ourselves and our immediate family and make sure that there's enough for us to survive? Or do we want to be more like Abraham and argue and say, no, that's not a good enough ending to this story. The way that I want this story to end is with more people being saved, not just me, my immediate family, and my descendants and the what I need to survive. So um, I think that Noah's imperfect depiction actually is very helpful for us in thinking about what exactly is the morality that maybe Noah didn't bring forward that we would like to be thinking about in terms of the environmental future that we want for our planet. Okay, I'm sorry, I've run a little bit past 1 o'clock. I'm going to lead us in the mourner's Kaddish. If you wish to join me in Mourner's Cottage, please do. If you want to leave now, I certainly give you permission to do so, but I want to thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much.
As always, tell you how much I appreciate and enjoy these opportunities
Very
to
good.
study together with all of you.
Thank
So
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you. It's a pleasure. I'll see you again
Excellent.
in just a few weeks in November. Okay, I'm going to read off these names and then we'll rise and we'll say Kaddish together. Passed away during this past month. Alice Layden, Freddie Markowitz, Annette Tucker. By the way, if you want to add any names into the chat, I now know to read them out loud. So please, you can do that or you can say them out loud. These are yahrzeits that have occurred during the past week. Pauline Abrahams, Melvin Adler, Jack Anditch, Gilbert Anion, Bernard Bash, Teresa Ruth Bell, Murrah Ben Gira, Ida Block, Maxine Bookman, Edwin Frank Brockman, Helen Breitbart, Minerva Chaskies, Gloria Chosen, Marvin Cohen, May Colburn, Sam Cordova, Leslie Davidson, Donald Dishell, David Dragon, Alex Engelman, Bess Etzhoken, Saul Etzhoken, Deborah Falcon, Mark Fox, Emma Friedman, Fred Franklin Frey, Bernard Garrod, Carrie Hayden Gerson, Derek Gerson, Marvin Gerstein, Samuel Goldfarb, David Goodman, Lawrence Goodwin, Lawrence Goodman, Eugene Goodwin, George Green, Gloria Grossbart, Sidney Guthman, Louis Handel, Ada Hecht, Sari Heller, Harvey Hertz, Sally Hullumby, Louis Hyman, Roanne Iskoff, Berta Itzbelinskaya, Jerome Jaffe, Elise Kahn, Miriam Klein, Christopher Knopf, Ruben Commissar, Michelle Liddell, Jerome Lightman, Russell Leventhal, Harry Lever, Francis Levy, Raphael Levy, Ida Lieberman, Melvin Daniel Lipman, Harlan Liss, Samantha Mack, Minnie Meadow, Esther Medina, Sandy Menine, Marvin Miller, Melinda Scheinkopf Miller, Paul Miller, Carol Neustadt, Thomas Nielsen, Greta Panish, Laura Pashko, Sarah Piat, Muriel Pivo, Sam Prell, Estera Pulvermacher, Nathan Rannon, Aaron Reifman, Dorothy Ressler, Barbara Rich, Bernard Rodsky, Ethel Rubin, Alan Ruvelson, Lee Schullinger, Siobhan Selvin, Lily Chappelle, Alexander Shapiro, Nathan Shepard, Malia Schleinberg, Rose Sikov, Melvin Singer, Donald Silverman, Lillian Stone, Judith Sugarman, Judith Sussman, Eileen Sweet, Samuel Taub, Betty Traeger, Albert Took, Joseph Tukin, Louis Tuller, Arturo Umansky, Clara Waldo, Elaine Weinstein, Jack Weisblatt, Elaine Weiss, Renee White, David Usem, Margaret Zickerman, Louis Ziff, and Molly Ziff. Is there anyone who would like to add a name to the names that I've just read? Okay.
Deb Gordon.
Thank you. And so acknowledging those also who have died defending the state of Israel and all those who have no one to say Kaddish for them, we join together as a community and recite the Kaddish together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. V'almad divarach rutei v'yamlich malchutei. Hayachon uv'yomachon uv'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi Shemei Rabbah Mevorach Le'olam U'amei Almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal Shemei Dekudesha Barich Hu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all of us who are mourning, all of us who are grieving, and may all find healing and renewal. And let us say together, Amen. Thank you all for being here. A pleasure to see your faces. I'll be back for, I think, Chaye Sarah in just a few weeks. I'll see you
Thank
then.
you.
Thank you very much.